there is ingrained in it is this, in this neoliberal project, is deleting and destroying and flattening social, cultural, and not to mention geopolitical hierarchies. So, of course, there is very much a totalitarian element in it, but it didn't work. It didn't work for 7 years unless you cajole large swaths of society by violence, and it didn't work in Georgia either. It's not going to work in Armenia, I don't think.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Pietro Shakarian and Lasha Kasradze. Pietro is an Armenian historian at the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, and Lasha is a Georgian international relations analyst working in the US as liaison officer for the Sokhumi State University. Today we want to discuss the many developments in the Caucasus region, from Armenia's crackdown on opposition forces to renewed EU pressure on Georgia and Azerbaijan's antagonistic policies towards Russia. A lot is happening right now. So, Pietro, Lasha, welcome back.
Pascal, thank you, Pascal. It's great to be here.
Lovely having you both back, because so many things are going on right now. Maybe we start with this crackdown in Armenia against opposition forces, but also against the church. Pietro, since that's your country, can you tell us more about it?
Well, I mean, Pashinyan is going completely crazy against the Armenian Apostolic Church. And I want to kind of frame that in a setting where, Armenia is, of course, not the only one in the post-Soviet region. There is this kind of crackdown going on against kind of the Orthodox churches in all these former Soviet countries. So we've seen the case with Zelensky. We see the case with Sandu. Even in Georgia, Zorabashvili goes against the church. We have this case. Lasha could probably speak to that better than I could. But in the case of Armenia, it's really a very serious question, because the church is so fundamental to the Armenian identity. So the Armenians, the Armenians were the first nation by tradition to adopt Christianity in the year 301 AD. So actually, well, that's the traditional date, 301 AD. They were the first Christian nation. Scholars debate the exact year, in which the Christianization happened. But the Christianity is a fundamental part of the Armenian identity. I mean, even when Armenia was being overrun by foreign invaders for centuries, the church acted as kind of like a kind of protective cover that would ensure that the identity was preserved, the language, the culture, everything. And also even the Armenian alphabet, which was invented by Saint Mesrop Mashtots in the year of 404 AD, or actually also could be 405, 406. There are different dates again that scholars use. This was also an outgrowth of Armenia's Christian identity. So the Christianity means so much to Armenia and Armenians, and also even look at the church architecture, right? So it's extraordinarily unique. It's extraordinarily important, but yet Pashinyan wants to go against this. And why does he want to go against this? Because the church is one of the remaining forces in the Armenian society where there can be kind of a hotbed of opposition. It's independent of the state. It's independent of the civil contract party that Pashinyan runs. And so because of that, because it's an independent force, and because it has massive popular support, right? Now, Pashinyan's ratings, you have to also think about it like this. At one point, Pashinyan, when he came into power, he had very high ratings. And now Pashinyan's approval rating is 13%, less than 13% even. It's really, really gone down. Whereas the church has an approval rating and a public trust rating of up beyond 90%. So you have to think of it like that. The church is an immensely, immensely respected institution in Armenia. And to go against it actually has even hurt Pashinyan even more. So when you see like the Armenian police going to the gates of Echmiadzin is the center of the Armenian Apostolic Church. It's the Vatican of the Armenian Apostolic Church. When you see that happening, where they're going against the church in such a violent, visceral way, people react to that. Pashinyan also uses very crude and very disrespectful language toward the church. He makes insinuations about the personal lives of the Catholicos, even that is to say, the patriarch of the Armenian Apostolic Church, right? So this is extremely serious, business going on. But it also shows that Pashinyan, he's not concerned about his national identity. He's not concerned about really the fate of his country. At the end of the day, he's really more concerned about, number one, preserving his political power, and number two, implementing kind of the plans and ideas of those who he is loyal to in the West, right? So Washington, Brussels, he sees more of, he follows them no matter what.
Yeah.
So that's the other element of this. Plus, also, I wanted to throw one more thing in there, that there was a very prominent Armenian, kind of businessman, Samvel Karapetyan, who was voicing support of the church. And he didn't even, explicitly say anything about overthrowing the Armenian government. He just said he was going to be supporting the church. And Pashinyan went very hard against him as well. So that's another element of this kind of saga going on right now.
One follow-up question to you, and then I will ask also Lasha to directly react to these what you're discussing here. But the follow-up question is that we first learned about this crackdown happening, which kind of came out of the blue. We learned about it on the 25th or 26th of June, and so about a month ago. And 4 days later, on the 30th of June, there was a meeting, Pashinyan with Kaja Kallas. I don't remember whether she flew to Armenia or he was in Brussels, but there was a meeting, and they. Kaja Kallas declared that ties between Armenia and the EU have never been better, and Armenia is a strong democratic ally, yada yada yada. And this came 4 days after this crackdown started. What do you make out of that?
Well, I think that a lot of it also goes in the context of what even happened with Iran recently, because when you had the so-called 12-day war, where Trump and Israel were attacking Iran, and there were these very serious threats to Iran maybe being fragmented or partitioned, or there could be a regime change there. There was talk about maybe Netanyahu would succeed in overthrowing the Islamic Republic and bringing in the Shah's son. But in the end, none of this, these kind of fanciful ideas didn't work out. There was a rallying around the flag, and in the end, Iran kind of was able to blunt kind of this, aggression that was coming from the United States and Israel against them. And really what it did was it kind of reinforced in the perspective of both Tehran and Moscow the importance of Iran, and also from the Russian, from specifically the Russian perspective, the importance of Iran and its position in the Caucasus, and the importance of Iran as kind of an important country that would kind of basically that kind of like links, that kind of helps reinforce the Russian position in the post-Soviet South, which is to say the Caucasus and Central Asia, and also kind of connecting in with China and BRICS, right? So it emphasized the importance of Iran, and also it re-emphasized the importance of the Caucasus to both Russia and Iran. So the Caucasus became even more important because, as we also know, in the context of this war with Iran, Azerbaijan was allowing Israel to use its territory to launch these drone attacks on Iran. So suddenly, again, the Caucasus as a whole region, not just necessarily Azerbaijan, but also Armenia, Georgia, this whole region became an area of greater attention, an area that came under greater scrutiny by both Moscow and Tehran. Because of that, I believe personally that this is one of the major reasons why Pashinyan did this crackdown now, why he began kind of talking with, Kaja Kallas now, because he really wants to kind of reinforce his position. He's also hoping that the EU might help, bolster his position in Armenia, because he understands that, and he is afraid perhaps that now with Russia and Iran seeing the greater value in the Caucasus region, Armenia's value will increase, because they understand that if Armenia were to have a government that actually met the interests of the Armenian people, then suddenly what you would have is a government that would be much more amiable toward BRICS, toward the kind of the North-South integration, toward Moscow and Tehran, and less toward the West. Yeah. But with Pashinyan there, Pashinyan is almost forcing the country against its will to go and be part of the EU Western sphere, even though it's very clear to many Armenians, by the way, that the EU has, it has lost some of its luster. That the reality of the EU and its problems are becoming more and more apparent, even to citizens in the post-Soviet space. So that's kind of the short story. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and let's not forget that this also comes on the heels of Armenia basically giving up Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, Azerbaijanis managed to win it over, but Armenia didn't even try to ask the Russians for help.
No, they didn't.
Said, look, he didn't want so. Lasha, how do you make sense of this, what's happening in Armenia at the moment?
Sure. First comments. I just want to make a few comments on briefly on the church, Armenian church. Indeed, it's part of the national consciousness of Armenia, as it is as the Georgian church is for the Georgians. It's played throughout centuries, since in case of Georgia, I think it was AD 337. Through the King Miriam, when Christianity was adapted. So it's part of the the genesis, if you will, or genetics.
And also Saint Nino. Saint Nino.
Yeah, Saint Nino is
absolutely.
I mean, look at it. First of all, I also mentioned it to Glenn, where we are, right? We are. This is Anatolia. This is Cappadocia. This is the Middle East. This is where all this, we basically were formed as nations in the South Caucasus under the influence of the Middle East and wider, as the South Caucasus is being called, the wider Middle East. But be that as it may, I understand what Pietro is saying. On a much deeper level, I relate to what he's saying, because there was patterns, very similar, if not identical patterns, when Saakashvili was in power. There was a collective perception in the Georgian society that he was going against the grain of sort of the Georgian sociocultural historic background when he was criticizing or going against the church. In other words, politically speaking, and there was some factual evidence for this as well. There was this widely accepted perception that Saakashvili and his United National Movement were against the Georgian church, i.e., sort of the tradition, that was supposed to be. That Saakashvili was supposed to be all about modernization of Georgia, right? So these narratives were being constructed, but it really exploded in their faces, and in many respects, church resisted. It kicked in sort of the counter social reaction, with aspects of perhaps nationalism, Georgian nationalism. So it's quite plausible that Pashinyan would probably face the same counter reaction from within his society when you go against such a deeply entrenched and ingrained institution as the Armenian Christian Church. These things sort of, touch on a raw nerve. They have a tendency of doing that. You can call them, old-fashioned and impractical and, in need of reforms. But that's something that is so deeply etched within the collective psyche, of Georgia and Armenia, respectively, that. I think I've always thought that politically speaking, strictly, going against it has always been a mistake in the Georgian case. You got to find a common language and a common, platform with which to, or upon which to deal and develop sort of domestic politics with such strong institutions as the Georgian Orthodox Church. So I understand where Pietro is coming from on that front, and I do think that this is also driven by the West, similar to that of what was happening in, under Saakashvili's government. Perhaps Pietro would agree with me on this, because this could be motivated or perhaps propelled by, collective West in terms of sort of, I don't want to say modernizing the Armenian society, but certainly causing, creating, difficulties in terms of hurrying up with reforms and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because, it's a big, this was the case in Georgia. The Orthodox Church was seen as a huge sort of a conservative break, sort of a backward power, social power that was not allowing these neoliberal, neo-economic, Western reforms to be implemented fast enough.
Why does this situation remind me so much of, how communism cracked down for 60, 70 years on those churches, didn't manage to eradicate them, and how part of the change that came, that blew up the many of the communist governments, actually came from churches, famously, of course, with Poland.
I just want to toss in something really quick about this. That actually it's interesting because after some point in the Soviet times, the Soviet authorities had to accommodate themselves with these churches in Armenia and Georgia. In fact, actually, if you talk to some Russians, they even complain that, the communist authorities, the Soviet authorities were harder against the Russian Orthodox Church than they were against the Armenian Church or the Georgian Church, because again, there was that national sensitivity. Because as Lasha says, the church is so infused with the Armenian identity, with the Georgian identity, that it's so hard to disentangle. Actually, in some ways, this is really, yes, there is the precedent of the communism, but in the way that the West is trying to do it, it really is kind of, again, trying to almost, at least with the communism, there was this idea that you're trying to replace the church with like a new kind of social system that benefits the people. There was this idea that they were trying to do something like this. But in this case, what they're trying to do is kind of replace the church, like what Lasha says, with kind of like a financialized neoliberal order, right? That, basically where the market becomes your new god. And, you should, not your church, not your traditions, not what is close to you, not you, like maybe your, I don't know, your, like I said, the alphabet, the rituals, everything that goes with being maybe an Armenian Christian, a Georgian Christian, that this is something that is perceived by these kind of so-called color revolutionary reformers as a threat. And not only in the case of Georgia and Armenia, but also, as I said, with Moldova, we see the same thing happening with Sandu now, also with Ukraine and Zelensky famously going against the Orthodox Church. So there is a pattern here. It needs to be highlighted.
But why would it make sense, and maybe Lasha first, why would it make sense for Armenia, for Pashinyan, to throw 100% of their geopolitical future into the lot with the Europeans, who will not and cannot defend them if ever Azerbaijan and Turkey gang up in order to kind of, create a corridor and, just reshape this part of the region? What do you think is the calculation there?
I think what connects all these cases in the South Caucasus is that the church is being seen as a drag on whatever the idea of progress these, young reformers had, simply put. Now, church has always been, rightfully so. The Orthodox Church in Georgia, for example, has a very controversial past. The communist, Soviet Union, communism, just like with Putin today. There is no doubt that the church is being used as soft power, to implement certain geopolitical, foreign policy, domestic policy agendas. But the problem is not that. That's just in my opinion, that's a defect of the system. That's politics. The problem starts, and if there is someone out there who would actually perhaps even reform that aspect of the church, fine. But the problem starts when you go against sort of the traditional aspect of the Orthodox Christianity in Georgia, and you do it by hitting the institution, which is the church. And you do it mainly because you are implementing somebody else's progressive opinions and ideas and views, as we've said many times on your channel, Pascal, Georgians are all about progress. We've said this before, correct? The Georgians would, to this day, they're naively attached to the idea of becoming part of the West one day. In such a society, when even this collective sort of political capital is not enough, and yet you are still going at directly trying to hit and break the spine of sort of this extremely important sociocultural institution, which is the Georgian Orthodox Church, well, then you have to assume that this is a purposeful sort of agenda. Just to give you an example, the German ambassador to Tbilisi, to Georgia, has become known as someone who directly insults sort of the tradition or the backwardness or of the church. And I have not seen this, but folks that are close to me who are academics, experts in their respective fields, have told me that he stood across the street in front of the government building and criticized one of the oldest churches that is located across the street in downtown Tbilisi, Christian churches. So you can tell that Western diplomats not only are they violating so the basic premise of diplomatic practice, of diplomacy, by directly getting involved and advising, so to speak, or encouraging certain political factions in Georgia, but they're sort of really, impudently, if you will, have the audacity now to directly attack the church. And the old traditions, and whatever stems out of the Orthodox Church in Georgia, sanctity of the family, etc. There's conservative values and hierarchies of that nature. So you see how blatant, how far they've come, right? I mean, how blatant they've become in their criticism that Western diplomats are now directly involved in criticizing the host culture, the Georgian culture, and I'm surprised the Georgians have not reacted much worse than they have so far. I'm always thinking, God forbid if Georgian society sort of that whole nationalism kicks in and they start to reject the entire Western experiment in Georgia. And really, I wouldn't want to, there would be another extreme side of this, right? So, which I wouldn't want to see as someone who's, lived and studied in the U.S. for 3 decades. But, this, by the way, attests to the fact that here is Georgia continuing to stay very loyal to the idea of them becoming part of the West. And yet somehow this ham-handed approach by Georgia's partners in Washington, in Brussels, right? And Pietro probably can relate to me with, they're just continuing to it's never enough, basically. They want extreme acceptance of their norms, of their progressive sort of extreme ideology to be accepted without question. And Maria Callas's of the world are basically saying this outright now.
Yeah, and I also just want to say this, I'm glad Lasha brought this conversation to this direction, because the EU actually, as a matter of fact, has been openly applauding Pashinyan on his attacks against the church. They've been openly praising what he's doing. So they're really praising in terms of their kind of walking on the traditions of the Caucasus region, of the traditional Armenian church, the traditional Georgian church. They have no regard for any of this. I remember even a few years ago when this was when Ivanishvili just came on the scene. The Georgian Dream just came on the scene. I was reading in The Economist here in the United States articles about Ivanishvili and how they were criticizing him, how they were, how they said, well, because the church is supporting him, that this makes him bad and all this kind of a thing. Well, I'm sorry, but the church is a pillar of the traditional Georgian society. What are you going to do? You can't remake, Georgia. At least at least in the case of the Soviet Union, Georgia was a part of the Soviet Union. You could make a case that, well, you can understand at least this is part of one country. There's a national policy to remake the whole country, remake the Soviet Union, or remake the traditional societies within the Soviet Union. But here is a case where you have an independent country, Georgia, or an independent country, Armenia, and you have an outside force completely, which isn't even part of the same state, coming in and telling them how to live, how their church should be, how their society should be ordered. It's extremely disrespectful, and it's extremely arrogant. And there's nothing, they say that this is maybe about democracy or something. There's nothing democratic about this. It's very dictatorial, as a matter of fact. So you talk about Kaya Kallas, she's extremely dictatorial when she's, lecturing Armenia and Georgia, let's say, or any of these countries about how to live, really, when it comes down to it.
Yeah, I mean, then again, I love repeating this. The Soviet-born daughter of a communist functionary who is now running EU foreign policy.
Absolutely.
I mean, that she and the Germans are heavy-handed and have zero regard for local traditions and so on is understandable. But isn't this just dumb? Because like the whole spiel of part of Russia today is to say like we help conserve traditions, right? I mean, isn't this going to push both of them, like at least popular perception, into the opposite direction of where the EU would want perception to go? Maybe Lasha and then Pietro.
The opposite direction. Well, yes. I mean, this is what I was talking about. Perhaps luckily, I have not seen any radical rejection of this. But that's also characteristic of Georgian nature. I mean, they're saying, okay, what are they going to do to us? Take away our church? I mean, that's an impossibility. So basically, the attitude from common folk is, let them speak their crazy things, and we're just going to sort of look the other way and enjoy our wine, sort of on a populist level. So I have not noticed much sort of anger that could have very well, quite plausibly could occur. And there were some extremist factions, by the way, that could be, that were used against, sexual minorities, whatever. So that, as a symbol of resistance against this neoliberal progressivist ideas. But very quickly, I just wanted to add, Pascal, our good colleague, Professor Gibbs's whole idea, not idea, but factual evidence, historic evidence of these people starting out as Trotskyist. And you see, and Pietro said this, and we were just alluding to this, that, this sort of stems out of the communist, reinvention of these, the new Soviet citizen, reinvention of the new Georgian citizen. These patterns were very much present when Saakashvili was reforming, quote unquote, the society. So that was part of it, no doubt. I mean, this historic evidence that leads back to this, that this whole ingrained in it is this, in this neoliberal project, is deleting and destroying and flattening social, cultural, and not to mention geopolitical hierarchies. So of course there is very much a totalitarian element in it. But it didn't work. It didn't work for 7 years, really, unless you cajole, large swaths of society by violence, and it didn't work in Georgia either. It's not going to work in Armenia, I don't think. I think I think aiming to transform the society from a socio-cultural perspective, from turning their own history upside down, that will always be extremely sensitive, and it's just now they will face resistance. But fortunately, though, I would say since before, I would say 2014 and the whole Ukraine crisis, and then of course before that 2008, this was sort of the tail end of the neoliberal project, and in many respects, Georgia survived that, because had it been to the extent that it once was, when John McCain would travel to Georgia, or that he would stand at Maidan, or that whole sort of the apex of neoconservative power, then Georgia might not have survived it. But I think luckily this whole shift towards multipolar world, I think, helped it.
I also want to just add, too, that I think Georgia, probably more than any other country in the region currently, understands really where the world is going. I mean, the Georgian elite, that is to say the Georgian dream, Bidzina Ivanishvili, they understand better than any of the other ruling elites in the Caucasus now that the world is going toward multipolarism, and that, you know, Georgia in this context, the whole pro-Georgian policy makes, you know, a lot of sense. Not only does it make a lot of sense, but it fits perfectly. It's perfectly in tune with where the world is going now. You know, Pashinyan is out of tune with where the world is going now. He is swimming against the current. He thinks that the EU is the future, right? I don't know why he thinks that because look at you would have to be blind not to see where the situation is going now, where that the EU has never been more fragmented, more in crisis than it is at this moment, and more out of touch with the citizens. So they talk about democracy, but Merz is talking about maybe, you know, he's thinking about a future war with Russia. He's thinking about, you know, rearming Germany. He's not thinking about the well-being of Germans, and same as Macron is not thinking about the well-being of the French. Or if you were to go outside the EU, where we look at Mr. Starmer, how Mr. Starmer does not care about the well-being of the English, the Scots, and the Welsh, let's say, or the Northern Irish. That's what we're dealing with right now. But we're dealing with a Europe that is not democratic. The elites are completely cut off with the people. And
but in this sense, Armenia, to me, seems pretty much in tune with what's happening with the European Union, because it seems to me that Pashinyan is also like completely out of touch with how probably a large majority of the Armenian public would like the country to move, not necessarily geopolitically, but at least when it comes to the church. And the one thing we must say is that the Europeans and the neoconservative movement in the United States, they never give up, do they?
No, they never give up.
Lasha, they're right now trying again to crack down on Georgia, maybe not with protests, but the EU is saying, like, unless you change and you take back that transparency law about your NGOs, unless you make it intransparent again, we are threatening you with, we take away your visa-free travel. I mean, that's a pretty harsh measure.
Not only that, Skal, but this Carlos now is talking about canceling the visa-free travel status for Georgia into the European, for Georgians into EU. This is the extreme side of this ideology. So not to mention the accusations of this government being less democratic. I mean, this makes absolutely no sense. It defies logic. It defies rationality. It makes absolutely no sense. I live here. I've been here for 2 months now. I study this country. I observe it. Factual evidence simply isn't there to support these claims. So you see that, you know, and Georgians, by the way, have realized this in the past few years, thanks to the Georgian Dream's, staunch resistance. For which I've always given them credit on geopolitics and regional, sort of foreign policy, the way they withstood this, enormous pressure, especially when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. And so they thought that this was yet another chance. And now with this situation with Armenia, with Pashinyan going shaking hands with Erdogan, I think this is sort of a much a weaker attempt, sort of 2.0 of the same thing. Perhaps I'm generalizing, but it's impossible to look at this any other way. The region, let me just sort of shift to sort of regional geopolitics, if you don't mind. Sort of there was this, strategic split, and Pietro probably will agree with me on this, between obviously the Turkic world and Russia, Iran, Armenia, where, strictly speaking, geopolitically would make much more sense for Armenia perhaps to at least step back and reevaluate what's happening, right? Because with Armenia being supported by Iran, Zangezur corridor, I think a shrewd, pragmatic, sort of, deep thinking on these issues would indicate that following the Turkic world, if you will, or they're getting excited about the idea that all of a sudden now Macron of France will save Armenia. And by the way, have you noticed how no one, I mentioned this yesterday with Alexander, actually, that no one is talking about Armenia's loss of Nagorno-Karabakh. However, that is, I'm not interfering here in Armenia's affairs, or however they perceive that this 30, 35 years of tragedy. But we all know how hard they fought, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden now we have the collective West. I'm not, look, Azerbaijan, we were all good friends in Georgia's, foreign policy is extremely sort of pragmatic and friendly with both Azerbaijan and Armenia. That's a different argument in and of itself. But no one in the West says, okay, you guys have nothing. You lost everything, and yet they're being, in other words, the major geopolitical and sort of in terms of Armenia's sovereignty, a major shift took place, right? A tragic change took place.
Yeah.
Here we are, collective West sort of. So I'm thinking the same about Georgia. So if Abkhazia and South Ossetia perhaps got really shaved off, let's just say Russia reinvaded Georgia. I mean, Russian troops are already there, and an extreme case scenario, in extreme sort of power projection, and then that Russia sort of translated this and decided to say, you know what, we're going to have to finish Georgia off, right? For example, I believe that not only the collective West wouldn't say anything, but they would say, whatever's left of you, just forget it. And maybe we can now start working about, making you part of us. Point being, there is not a single country in the West that cares about the separatist movements or what it does to mainland Georgia or mainland Abkhazia or whatever. In other words, they got nothing to do with regional geopolitics.
Yeah.
It's all about, geopolitically speaking, instrumentalizing the entire space of the South Caucasus, obviously Ukraine, and using it and basically figuring out how to weaken Lasha. Lasha. So how to weaken Moscow. Let me just say Moscow. So, this is the problem. Not that anyone cares about the sovereignty and national security of these countries, right? Of these republics. So, that's the tragedy of South Caucasus, really.
Pietro, please.
I just wanted to say though about,
if you could edit that later, Pascal, that would be great.
it's the Caucasus. I just want to make a point about this whole situation with Karabakh that Lasha was mentioning. Actually, there was always this like super small minority, even among Armenian liberals. So even Armenian liberals were not, I mean, even people who, you would consider maybe liberal in the Armenian context, were not so thrilled or were never support, let's say, giving away Karabakh. But you did always have a faction of Armenian liberals who said, if we just gave away Karabakh, the people there, supporting them, it's a burden for us. If we gave it away, then we could, kind of kick Russia out of the region and integrate with Turkey and the West. There is this faction of Armenians, as remarkable as it may seem, there is this faction of Armenians who would say such things. And so Pashinyan is really following in that playbook, thinking that if we sacrifice Armenian national security, if we give away, it's not only just giving away the land of Nagorno-Karabakh or the land of Artsakh, as the Armenians say, but giving away the history, the churches, the identity, that this was a land where there were Armenian principalities, going back to the original Russian expansions of the Caucasus in the 1720s, or the Peter the Great's Caspian campaign. You had the alliance with the Armenian Meliks of Sunik or Zangezur and Karabakh with Vakhtang VI of Georgia, hoping that the Russians would come down. So there's a long history here. And most importantly of all, the self-determination of the Karabakh people. The Karabakh Armenians wanting to determine their own future, right? And this is a very distinct subgroup of Armenians. They have their own dialect. It's almost like, kind of it's like the main part of Georgians versus, let's say, Mingrelians. So Karabakh Armenians are almost like Mingrelians. They're their own kind of distinctive people within the Armenian context. But to just sacrifice those people and just to think, well, integration with the EU is so much more important than our history, our culture, our identity, the rights of these people to democratic self-determination. So really, it's an anti-democratic move. That's why I think it's so ridiculous when Pashinyan says, I'm defending democracy. But in reality, he's giving away the democratic rights of these people of Nagorno-Karabakh. He's just like saying your right to determine your own future is irrelevant. That the EU is more important than your right to stand up for your own democratic future. So that's what I think is so important about this. That's why I really think it's important to highlight how these kind of these geopoliticians in Washington or Brussels, just like Lasha says, they don't care about the South Caucasus. They don't care about Abkhazia or Artsakh or any of these regions. All they care about is how can we use this region as a bludgeon against Russia, and how can we integrate these people in kind of the financialized neoliberal order that we're creating here. They don't care really about the well-being or the future or certainly the democratic rights of the people of this region. Because if they did, it would be a completely different story.
If I may just very quickly. Okay, go ahead.
No, I just need to add, it's not just these politicians and it's not just Pashinyan. It is the entire system now that kind of is now working toward a new reality, especially for the Caucasus, in which these long-held beliefs that, borders are negotiated, if at all, and we will remain what we are is obviously not true anymore. The Europeans don't give a damn about Azerbaijan just like changing borders by force and expelling 100,000 Armenians like from Nagorno-Karabakh. They don't care about Azerbaijan actually then functioning as a launching pad for attacks on Iran. Azerbaijan obviously has some let's say motivations towards the Azeri population in Iran, and all of this is leaving the Caucasus in a very precarious state, isn't it? And again, like Georgia, 2 of Georgia's provinces are still under Russian under direct Russian control. I mean, the entire Caucasus seems to be slowly but seriously not disintegrating but changing. I mean, by power, by force. Isn't that a huge problem actually?
I think this is
actually
also
maybe Lasha first and then
Lasha.
Let me I'll just very briefly, this is also part of this whole sort of coming together of the Eurasian geopolitical space as it affects the South Caucasus. Mind you, notice these recent changes are really sort of diplomatically revolutionary. I mean, Azerbaijan regaining its territory, right? For example, no outside Western power doing anything about it. Not even Russia did anything about it, but by the way. That doesn't mean that there was this whole separate sort of analysis on security, right? So, but in terms of sort of soft power, geoeconomics, there is no doubt that Azerbaijan has become sort of the leading country among the 3 South Caucasian republics, even though all those scandals just took place recently between Baku and Moscow. I think it is understood in Baku that that stops there, right? There won't be crossing some national security and geopolitical interests of Russia. They're not foolish enough to do that with this whole talk of Erdogan placing troops in Baku. I think that conversation was shut down very quickly. But what I was going to say was that the irony here is that if there is a chance, for example, for Georgia in this case, to restore its sovereignty fully and territorial integrity, it will have to happen via Moscow. Yes, perhaps the third, state that will have to sit, even if it comes to that, will have to sit at the table, and it will be Washington, it will be the United States, perhaps. But generally speaking, if you look at history, if there is a chance that even in the early 90s, or even shortly after Saakashvili came to power, Moscow's attitude, and I'll probably be chastised for this, was step by step, let's work together, right, with Georgia and see what we can do. And this also reminds me when Zelensky came to power, got elected, and he said, we don't want any problems with Russia. Remember that. He even he met with Putin. He said, and then immediately something kicked in Washington and Brussels, and they said, wait a minute, is this guy going to develop some sort of friendly relations with Moscow? Yes. Well, that's unacceptable. So we're going to have to do everything in our power to do Maidan, to do, to provoke Russia, and then end up with, February of 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In other words, there is this inherent behind the scenes work going on that does not allow for peaceful outcomes to take place within the region. By having some sort of a pragmatic, a mutually beneficial relationship between these small republics and Russia. And there will always be a disadvantage, strategic disadvantage, political, economic, military, of course. But I've always believed that there is no, there's few sort of rationale is not strong enough for this in the post-Soviet space, in the post-Soviet Russia, to have these continuing conflicts. Yes, it's the product of the Soviet Russia that these countries and these regions have been sort of dissected. There was a strategy behind it, but in the post-Soviet era, there were chances of, at the very least, not to have gone to these kinds of extremes where Russia comes in, invades Georgia, recognizes Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states within Georgia. So these things are, there's plenty to indicate that are not meant to be resolved independently. And now that we are seeing sort of chances of this might happening, we are seeing how the West is acting. The West is not giving up on this. And the idea that somehow independently South Caucasus can take care of its own business with Russia, with Iran, with Turkey, with that is unacceptable. Because that not only with geoeconomic projects might isolate the collective West, but geopolitically, it will strengthen Russia. And they understand this. Pietro.
I just wanted to say too, also, it's important to highlight in the case of particularly with specifically with Georgia, also to highlight the agency of these people, the Abkhaz and the Ossetians, because again, when Russia's saying, let's work all together, they're talking about let's have the Georgians sit down with Abkhaz and Ossetians and maybe come to some solution where maybe they have some kind of autonomy or home rule within Georgia or something like that. So it's important, first of all, to highlight that. The second thing I also want to say is that, yes, Azerbaijan, it emerged from this, with its hands strengthened from this, conquest of Nagorno-Karabakh, but it is making very serious miscalculations in the region. So it has not crossed a certain red line, yes, but the fact that it feels empowered to go this far, even this far, and be this arrogant in how it deals with both Moscow and Tehran simultaneously, I think it's really, really, significant. And I think the Russians are also waiting for the moment where Aliyev basically kind of, goes too far. That I think that right now, when you see what he's doing, specifically, it's not just about, the plane issue. It's not just about this whole, business with the Azeri diaspora and Yekaterinburg. It's also this, now Aliyev is making noise about his vocal support for Ukraine. He's not even trying to disguise it. If before Azerbaijan was trying to kind of like say, well, we're going to be supporting Ukraine, but kind of semi behind the scenes, now Aliyev is openly saying, Ukraine should resist occupation. That, how we resolve the Karabakh issue, that's how Ukraine should resolve Donbass. Just kick the people out, and just conquer it by force. That's the way to do it. Well, I think actually even that would be very insensitive to the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians can see how successful it has been to have this war. That really, Ukrainians are being decimated. Majority of the Ukrainians want the war really to end, but yet you have this, pipsqueak in Baku who is saying that, you should continue the war and eventually you'll conquer Donbass. Never mind that the people in Donbass don't want to be part of Ukraine, but he's saying this. But in any case, he is extremely, empowered. He's, extremely, hubristic in his approach toward Moscow and Tehran, but eventually it's going to come back and hit him. And in terms of power, in terms of power in the region, it's not only necessarily about, how much financial power you have or how much military power you have. It's also how you politically balance successfully between different countries. And Azerbaijan, frankly, for 3 decades has been very close to the geopolitical interests that are overtly anti-Iranian and overtly anti-Russian. If we look at their interests, for example, in the West, look at Washington, D.C., the Azerbaijanis have been very close with the Israeli lobby, with the American military-industrial complex, with big oil. Look at BP's influence in Azerbaijan. This has been for 3 decades. It has not changed. And to think that somehow overnight, maybe if you're looking at it from Moscow's point of view or Tehran's point of view, and you think somehow maybe we can make them change, maybe we can integrate them into BRICS or whatever, this government is not doing that. And these recent episodes show that it is still very much in that vector. It's still, even though it's maybe in terms of political values, it might be different from, or might not be palatable to, let's say, Brussels. Brussels is still dealing with it. Brussels still likes to talk about oil deals with Aliyev. They don't care about the human rights of, let's say, the Artsakh Armenians or anything like this. So that's kind of how, I would just.
Well, that's a common common hypocrisy with the collective West. I mean, there's plenty of places out there that with horrific human rights record, but just to go back to my point, to your point about Azerbaijan being, yes, actually I was trying to put together some ideas for an op-ed, and I used that word hubris. And you know what? Let me push back on that slightly. I don't think that Baku is foolish enough, because look, we know that Turkey has been sometimes supporting Ukraine, sometimes criticizing Ukraine. Russia has been supporting Iran when it needs to. Whenever it sees carrots from the West, it criticizes Iran, obviously the nuclear program. So these countries in the same vicinity of geopolitical vicinity have always done this. But when at the height of a Russo-Turkish conflict, diplomatic conflict, when Turkey shut down a military plane of Moscow, I mean, things were amended. But they went back to they improved on it, and they went back to diplomatic peace with Turkey's apology. I think Erdogan directly apologized, if I remember correctly. But be that as it may, for a second, I think in case of Aliyev, I would actually make the case that Aliyev understands what the red lines are. I'll give it to you absolutely that Aliyev now is saying, and Azerbaijan feels emboldened, and I think it does have some reasons. It's under the protection of a NATO country, Turkey. It's legitimate. It has restored its territorial integrity, and it is on that line with Israel, correct? With the strong diplomatic relations with Israel, and of course plenty of energy resources for the region. But there is no doubt in my mind that Azerbaijan will continue to need the economic intercourse with Russia. I think it's close to $5 billion. Plenty for Azerbaijan. I don't think it's in Aliyev's interest to disrupt that flow. And I certainly don't think the case is much stronger to maintain this diplomatic relationship between Azerbaijan and Russia when it comes to security and red lines.
I just want to say, though, I agree with you completely. Lasha, I agree with you completely that the logic would dictate that. The logic would absolutely dictate that.
Sure.
And so when you look at, for instance, the statements coming from, I guess, Peskov or Zakharova about this whole situation, they say, well, we hope Azerbaijan understands that its interests are in cooperating with Russia, that they have a lot to gain by working with us, by participating in the North-South corridor, because for many Russians, actually, that's the fastest route between Russia and Iran would be through the territory of Azerbaijan. So there is this kind of hopeful tone that we hope they understand the strategic interests. But time and time again, we've seen that rather than pulling back, Aliyev continues to expand the confrontation. Now, I hope what you're saying is correct, that he understands that red line. But the evidence would indicate to me that he keeps on pushing that red line. So, for example, this airplane incident, he didn't need to make this into a big, cause célèbre. The same thing with this Yekaterinburg incident. I mean, that this is basically we're dealing with Azerbaijanis who were, Russian citizens of Azerbaijani descent. So why would then Baku make a huge deal about this, taking Russian citizens, Russian tourists, beating them up, putting them on TV, making it a huge thing? It seems like what we see a pattern of escalation. And whenever Russia is restrained, for example, during the Karabakh War in 2020, Azerbaijan shot down a Russian helicopter. Russia was very restrained. They thought, okay, in time, we'll react to this, but for now, we'll just assume, you didn't mean this necessarily. When Azerbaijan shot Russian officers during the ethnic cleansing of Karabakh, Russia was very restrained. All right? And yet, regardless of all of this, Azerbaijan has taken advantage of the Russian restraint to push and push and push. And now you see...
So let me ask you this. Yeah. Do you think there is this Western hand in this? Because this was
definitely
diplomatic brouhaha. This was so, yeah.
I definitely do. I definitely think Aliyev, first of all, as I said, he has extensive ties that have been cultivated for 3 decades, perhaps even over 3 decades, with these very strong Western interests that have always wanted to, attack Iran, that have always wanted to really even balkanize Iran. When we talk about this idea of promoting separatism in Azerbaijan, which, by the way, Iranian Azerbaijanis don't want to separate from Iran. They're comfortable being part of Iran. You just even ask, the Supreme.
I'm with you on that.
All right, yeah, absolutely. So they're not. No, but this is not necessarily realistic. But it doesn't mean that the danger of trying something like this isn't there. Like I would have said, it's foolish to have a war against Iran, but yet that didn't stop Israel and Trump from attempting to, obliterate the Iranian nuclear program. But anyways, no, I just wanted to say, do you want to add something about this?
I just need to add, let's not forget that we are right now getting the blueprint for Azerbaijan, how this could go down with, Azerbaijan, maybe if it gets lucky, gets to do 2 parts of Iran, what Israel is currently doing to Syria, right? And then once the state starts falling apart, you move in, you're a protective force for the minorities, and you create your corridor, you create your buffer zone, you annex your Golan Heights, and so on and so forth. I mean, all of these precedents, it's not just Kosovo and the Balkans that show us like what the West is willing to support. It is right now the Middle East, like very, very close, right? Just down there, where we now see how all of this can be broken apart. And this is one more question. First to Pietro and then also to Lasha. This example that is being created on the Palestinians and the population of Gaza, that even a genocide is possible. How does that impact, especially Armenia, which has its own genocide history? I mean, is there an impact of this?
Well, first of all, the Armenian people, by and large, the Armenian people overwhelmingly sympathize with the people of Palestine, and they sympathize with the people of Gaza amid this whole genocide. And frankly, I think the Armenian government should be even joining forces with South Africa and Ireland opposing genocide in Gaza. That's my take on it, and that's also my analysis on it, what I perceive. But also, it's the case that Armenians have seen for a long time now that Azerbaijan has been very close to Israel, that Israel has been sending weapons to Azerbaijan in advance of this, attack, in advance of this ethnic cleansing on Nagorno-Karabakh. Many Armenians, even when they look at Gaza, especially Armenians in the Middle East, in places like Lebanon, in Syria, when they look at Gaza, they say that, well, this was tried out before. And I don't necessarily mean in 1915. I mean that they even perceive that Azerbaijan's so-called anti-terrorist operation to ethnically cleanse Artsakh was seen as a precursor to what could be accomplished. If, Azerbaijan, supported by Israel and by Turkey and by NATO, can go in and ethnically cleanse Artsakh and nobody does anything, then what can stop Israel from doing that against the Palestinians in Gaza? So there is a precedent that is set by doing something like that. In the case of the larger geopolitical context, we have again there was this idea of the Primakov triangle, kind of going back to Primakov, the great kind of Russian, foreign policy guru.
Kissinger, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And so, but he was thinking more in terms of India, China, and Russia. But you could even put that like, Russia, China, and Iran, because Iran now is emerging as one of the major foremost players in BRICS. As I said, it's a huge node on kind of that, kind of connecting West Asia with Central Asia. And so it's of enormous importance for the One Belt, One Road initiative, also for Russia trying to shore up its, influence in the post-Soviet South. And so there would be, again, kind of an effort to really kind of undermine this, to really kind of, kind of push back against this. And Aliyev, like I said, for all this time has been very integrated with those exact forces that want to advance this agenda. I mean, we see that he is the one, together with Mr. Erdogan, who is supporting what is going on in Gaza, that 60% of Israel's oil is coming from Azerbaijan through Turkey to Israel. So at the end of the day, it's a country that's deeply involved. And what we see is a lot of smoke and mirrors, just like what we see in Syria now, where, you have Israel is bombing Syria, you have, Jolani there. There's this kind of effort to kind of co-opt the Druze, to make the Druze pro-Israeli. And so there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in this, and certainly in the case of the Caucasus as well, where Aliyev pretends at one point, like, yes, I'm somebody who looks at the world in a very kind of BRICS-like way, and that I view that we're moving into the multipolar moment and all that. But in truth, he is not looking at it like that. In truth, he's still very close to, he sees a world where the United States, where Israel, where Brussels, those he still views as the dominant forces. And that if he collaborates with them, that he can even gain some territorial dividends. Let's say if Iran were, to be broken up or something like that. That brings me back all the way to Georgia, when I am saying that Georgia, I think, is the one country in the region that really understands fundamentally what the multipolar moment means, what BRICS means. And that's kind of more or less how I see it. I think the Georgian dream is the most pragmatic force in terms of the Caucasus in this regard.
I see it in the same way, but the last 2 minutes of today's discussion go to Lasha, please.
Sure. Let me just stick to regional geopolitics here, because I don't want to touch on sort of ethnic cleansing and what happened in Abkhazia and all this, are very controversial issues. But in terms of sort of simple geopolitics, Georgia, it is plausible to imagine the scenario where, if this escalates with Iran, that Georgia might be given a choice. If Taiwan is attacked, or they decide to go for it, Australia will be given a choice. Either you are with them or with us, or you cannot stay neutral, right? So Georgia being this weak, small state, I see the risks there, absolutely, in the worst case scenario, where either it will have to agree for logistical support for the collective West, or worse. Now, I don't, it's plausible to envision this scenario, but to what extent it is probable is another question. I mean, what the probability of it is. It's possible and it's plausible. But, what are the risks of that happening right now? It's hard to say. It's impossible to predict that, although those risks exist. I think, yes, I shared that with Pietro, that the current government has found that perfect balance, if you will. We're doing well with Azerbaijan. We're doing well with Armenia, with Iran. I remember when Golbachidze, the current prime minister, flew to, I forgot what the occasion was, but flew to Tehran. It was being criticized, and to some extent perhaps, but I think it was just pragmatic politics. I didn't really fundamentally see anything wrong with it. So you can see that Georgia Dream and on the foreign policy regional front, I think it recognizes the necessity of being pragmatic with everyone in the region, especially with Russia. And this split, this strategic split between this Turkic world that leads to Israel, Turkey, the collective West, where, by the way, France and United States, to some extent, are trying to sort of shove Armenia now into this, where there is no formula where Armenia can find itself in, right? I mean, by the way, Petro, if you want to finish this off by telling me, explaining to me sort of what does Pashinyan think strategically where Armenia is going, and I'll be grateful. But I just don't see how this is going to be long-term beneficial for Armenia. But be that as it may, in terms of Georgia, I think, I agree that it has to continue. Even on geoeconomic projects, Zangezur corridor that doesn't directly might affect, Georgia, in terms of it being an asset in other geoeconomic sort of Tbilisi cars, Baku Tbilisi, cars, railway project, or the Ceyhan project, or the geoeconomic projects that Shevardnadze put Georgia on radar. When, by the way, they pushed away Russia in the beginning, shortly after the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union broke up. But be that as it may, in geoeconomics and geopolitics, I think Georgia is not in such a bad shape right now. The question is, if the region explodes by escalating, the conflict in Iran, will Georgia face a very drastic choice of either staying neutral or becoming sort of part of the collective West effort to finish off Iran? And by the way, let's not forget Russia, because Iran is perhaps the most important geostrategic country right now. Still,
absolutely.
And if Russia loses Iran, then I always say you're looking at China, you're looking at India. India is competing with Pakistan, and forgetting the name of that port, but I know the Chabahar port is part of this whole project with Iran, going into the Central Asia and then to Europe for India. So, India has a multi-vectoral strategic importance, and Russia, I don't think, is going to be willing to give up on that. So, yeah, down the road, it is possible to sort of to think that if this escalates and the region starts to blow up, Georgia might be asked to make a choice.
I would just say also, for my advice to Georgia would be avoid as much as you can, and I mean just avoid completely being pulled into a second front, because that's another issue that's at play here. That when the West is supporting, let's say, these kind of radically pro-Western political forces in Georgia, the Saakashvili types, in this moment against the Georgian Dream government, it's with the intention of forcing Georgia into this scenario where they lose maybe Abkhazia and South Ossetia even permanently, or that really it kind of uses Georgia as a bludgeon against Russia. And Georgia does not want that. Georgia does not need that. In terms of Pashinyan's strategic calculus, I mean, I think that he is completely delusional. I think that there is no rational reason. I think about this myself as somebody who's Armenian, who observes Armenian politics very closely. I don't understand at all what is the rationale for sacrificing your country's security. I mean, it's even to a point where Pashinyan is talking about, I mean, not only did he, give up Artsakh or give up the people's rights in Artsakh, but also now he's talking about even giving away the Zangezur corridor. There was recently a statement by Trump's envoy to basically to Turkey, who said that, maybe we should buy the Zangezur corridor. So like this hyper-transactional approach is, I guess, coming to the Caucasus now, where before they were talking about buying Greenland. Now they're talking about buying Zangezur. They're talking about buying Sunik, so this, I think, is extremely dangerous, and I don't see any strategic calculation. Actually, I think Pashinyan, frankly, is acting on the orders of external forces. There's no other way to explain it. Is he acting on behalf of Armenia's national legitimate security interests? No, he's not doing that at all. He's acting on behalf of those forces that want to use Armenia and want to use Georgia and even Azerbaijan against Russia and against Iran, right? So that's how I perceive it in the end.
And let me
It's impossible to envision this or to analyze this, like with for example, with the problem with Iran right now, Israel's bombing of Iran, without this larger picture you just mentioned, by the way. So Pascal, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and let me just end this also by saying that historically speaking, the forces that do not accept neutral solutions, win-win solutions or independent solutions, is not the Russians, it is the West. That makes it impossible for neutralist solutions to emerge, because they are not conducive to these to this mindset of you know, our way is right, the other way is wrong, and we need to shove it down their throats, right? The Azerbaijani approach to dealing with Nagorno-Karabakh. So I must say, like, these neutralist approaches in order to further national interests needs to be heavily fortified against.
I just want to say one thing. That this was actually fundamentally, Pascal, at the heart of the whole, you know, situation with Ukraine.
Yes.
Because again, Ukraine was trying to find a way to be neutral, to have the best of both worlds, just like how Armenians and Georgians want to have the best of both worlds. But in the end, you know, that wasn't good enough. In the end, Ukraine was forced to make a choice. They had to make a choice between Russia and EU. There was no middle ground at all.
And it was forced into a choice with very, very brutal methods, with 100 people killed on the Maidan. It was forced into this spiral of escalation. It tried to snap back several times, including in 2022. And they're trying to do exactly the same thing to Georgia and, of course, Armenia, where they apparently already succeeded in capturing the elite decision-making circles, because these people are not willing to have bridges. They want walls and fortified frontiers. I think that's what we're fighting against, for people who advocate for neutralist bridge building solutions. There's a whole strain of the West which wants to tear those bridges down because they're not in their interests.
And it used to be that, I mean, I just want to say this, it used to be that the West was against walls. Like, they were against the Berlin Wall. They were all for tearing down the Berlin Wall. Now they're for building new walls.
They're against these walls when they stand in the way of expansion, and they understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're for them
100%.
when they help them to fortify stuff against the enemy. Anyhow, my friends, I'm sorry that we are ending on a pessimistic note, but thank you very much for the overview of this. I will put links to your both profiles into the description of this video, and we will talk soon again. Pietro Shakarian, Lasha Kasradze. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pascal.